if you want the audio.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for your patience. It sounds like, as Dr. Bailey said, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties with our audio for any of the video. So if you're just joining us, we will get you links to those videos and you will have that. And we are recording this session. And so, as always, I'll be sending out those links to you in a follow-up email following the session, and as soon as the recording is available, when that is all available, I'll send that out. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Bailey, since we are a little bit after the fact. And as you see here, if you are needing a certificate of attendance, I will be sharing different links in the chat for you today. And so if you are needing a certificate, please make sure you fill that out. And then Jennifer Duncan, our administrative assistant, will send you a certificate of attendance. If you would rather wait until the final one and you've attended all three, we can send you a certificate for all three in one certificate as well. So, and then also be watching for some information on that SDI book study. We are going to be following this book study up there, the final session with Dr. Bailey. That book study will begin on February 11th, and you will receive a free book if you do fill that registration form out. Excuse me. And so, Dr. Bailey, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you. Please make sure you do fill out that evaluation following the session as well. And Dr. Bailey has that in her slide deck. So thank you for being here. And thank you so much, Dr. Bailey, for being here with us today.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Yeah, and I'm sorry about the videos not working today, but I'll be able to sort of talk you through it, because I think a lot of the methodology that you're going to see today is very visual anyways, and that's why it's been shown to be effective for certain disability categories. But just a reminder, this is a 3-part session. We're now on our second part. And really the intent is to sort of break down the 3 areas of instructional adaptation that are part of IDEA's definition of specially designed instruction. And what we really want to make sure that we're sharing with you are practical approaches. So you should have received a handout for today's session. So I had one last time, and that's about content adaptations. And then there is one specifically for today's session with this methodology adaptations. And it describes some of the most common methodology adaptations that we see in special education. There are links within that handout that brings you to resources to help you with the implementation of it, because we only have 60 minutes, and so we won't be able to get too deep into each one. So that's part of the accessing resources, is that handout will have links to all of those. So in our next session, we'll talk about delivery. And I think a lot of times people confuse the methodology and the delivery, but they're 2 different things. When we think about methodology, it's the way that we teach, right? The methods, in a sense, of the actual instructional design and the way that we're teaching that. The delivery adaptations, which we'll talk about next week, are really more about like where we're putting the student, who might be delivering that, the number of minutes. And so the last one is mostly impacting the way that you do the minutes for your IEP. So we'll definitely dive deep into that. We've sent out a couple of times links to a Q&A. And so if Dina sees any of those in the Q&A, she'll just chime in and share them. But you can also share questions at any time. You will see a Q&A box at the bottom. If it's not relevant to today and we'll want to talk about it next time, we'll just log that and then bring it up in our next session. So I want to do just a quick review to get us back to where we are. In our previous session, we really talked about, how we got to where we are, and we're mostly in this special education box at the moment. And if you think about the statement of services and aids, that's part of the IEP, it's got 4 main services. We've got our related services, which are designed to assist the student in benefiting from their special education services, which is what we'll talk about today. And then you also have these supplementary aids and services. And I want to just remind folks that those are the services that we provide within the general education classroom to ensure that the student has full access. So you will have this tier one methodology, right, that's being used by the classroom teacher. What we're talking about today are going to be the methodology that shows up only within our, not only, but within our specially designed instruction. Now, in a well-functioning school, if a student needs a particular methodology within special education, we would also hope that it would show up within the general curriculum. And as you look at some of the methodologies that have large effects for students with disabilities, they're also really effective for kids without disabilities. So we start to see some of those things within tier one. For example, explicit instruction. It is the #1 methodology shown to benefit students with disabilities. It also works for kids who are struggling, who don't have a disability, for second language learners, for gifted students. I mean, it has this broad application, but there might be a student with a disability who needs that particular methodology, which is why it shows up in their IEP. The other thing that you're going to see down here is that program modifications and supports for school personnel. And I think this is where we see this direct connection between the supports for school personnel and the methodology that we select. So for example, I'm a new teacher. The IEP team, prior to me actually joining the school, had identified a multisensory approach as the primary methodological adaptation. Adaptation. I don't know anything about that, but I'm responsible for delivering this instruction using that methodology. So in the supports for school personnel, I could request training so that I have the skills. Let's say I choose to use Orton Gillingham or something else to be able to use that methodology for the special education delivery. Oops. So when we think about that SDI, remember, we're looking at this adaptation, meaning there was this curriculum and instruction that was provided to the student, and because of the disability, we're having to adapt it. And eventually that adaptation becomes so unique that it can't be delivered as part of the general curriculum. It needs to be delivered as part of special education. And so if we look at why we're doing this, right, is to address the unique needs. Now, there's a lot of methodology that I'm going to share today that you probably are using all the time. And a good special ed teacher understands the methodology with known effects for students with disabilities. But when we think about having a methodology adaptation, the only reason it would go into the IEP is if the student's data indicate the student needs it. So for example, if I don't have any, data that indicates the kid needs, I don't know, discrete trial teaching, I'm not going to write it in the IEP. However, as I implement the IEP, I might use discrete trial training or teaching. And that's an important distinction because we only document methodology that the data indicate the student's need. If it's not indicated, then we use the methodology that we see as most appropriate for delivering that instruction or through the IEP. And I'll talk about that a little more later. So we talked about the last three, and today we're going to talk about that methodology, how the instruction is actually delivered, or the practices or the approach to the instruction that the teacher uses. So similar structure to last time, it's like, how do we know what methodology? There is so much out there, and I think a lot of you during your educator prep program learned about tons of them. But the trick here is to be able to match the appropriate methodology with the student need. And it's not about just matching it, but it's determining, does the student actually need this methodology, or is it the methodology that I'm going to use to be able to deliver it? So when I talk about how do I know what methodology adaptations are needed, I'm talking specifically about what methodology this kid needs based on the data that we have. So when we look at these considerations, there are three main buckets. So you'll see on the right-hand side, that's the handout you have. So this information is down towards the bottom of that. But the evaluation report is pretty much your go-to place because that's how, remember, the student had just become eligible for special education. So if there is a specific methodology, a common one that we see sometimes in evaluation reports might be applied behavior analysis. And the evaluation report indicates that this student needs that, then you already have that information outlined for your IEP. The present levels, we'll talk a little bit about that, but it really helps outline more of what we've seen previously in terms of methodology implementation, or maybe some of the unique characteristics of the student's need that we want to be able to address. And then finally, there's a different way. Unlike the content adaptations that we talked about last time, there is a way for you to document and really confirm or disconfirm whether certain methodologies are appropriate. In the end, if you have no data that indicates the kid needs a particular methodology, the recommendation is to not include it in the IEP, right? Because if you look here, what you see is this or, right? You already likely have the content adaptation. We talked about that last time. Maybe right now you don't know what methodology this kid needs. You don't need to include that in the IEP. And you use something like a database individualization to be able to sort of test certain methodologies and confirm whether it works or it doesn't work. So we talked about the evaluation report, and remember, there has to be that need that's documented within the report. And that's really, if the evaluation report doesn't list a particular methodology, then it becomes our sort of decision to pick what we want to use. We don't document it in the IEP, but in our delivery of the IEP services, we might use a particular methodology. There are some, and you'll look at the second page of the handout that I gave you, there are some types of methodology that have very strong effects for certain disability categories, particularly kids with autism or significant intellectual disabilities. And I've indicated that in the narrative of each of those. And so if you think about, you know, this is a student with autism, he's struggling with learning social behaviors, the data suggest he might need this type of methodology, then that's where I would start. And then you use your progress monitoring to be able to determine whether that was appropriate or not. So we think about too, the evaluation report, maybe it doesn't, sorry, this should say methodology, doesn't identify those methodology areas. So last time we talked about autism, and you can still use your previous handout, and it identifies what are the content adaptations that the student needs. And then we also look at, is there some specific methodology that this kid needs to learn those particular skills? And so by using the definition that we see or the identified content area needs, we can sometimes select an appropriate methodology that the evidence shows goes with that content area. So here's an example. So we have the student with autism. He is struggling based on his evaluation report in verbal and nonverbal communication and social behaviors and interactions. And so we want to know, what are the methodologies that have known effects for supporting students with those particular needs? And on the right-hand side, this is the second page of the handout that I shared. But you'll see on the left is kind of pulling some of those out, that there is an evidence base for some methodology specifically for addressing that content area. Social stories, peer-mediated instruction, discrete trial teaching, and I'll show some videos, no sound, but I'll show some videos of these here in a second. And that's what helps us as a special ed teacher. If we know the content, that was our first session, then we can narrow down the methodologies that have been shown to be able to deliver that content. So remember, if there's no data that indicates that this student needs it, we don't initially document it in the IEP. So what we end up looking at is our initial IEP might say this kid needs specially designed instruction in social behavior, in addressing social behaviors. And in that IEP year, as we implement it, we're trying to find out other adaptations that are needed, such as the methodology adaptation and the delivery adaptation. And once we find those and have data indicating that's what the student needs, that's what we include in the next IEP, right? We don't have to know everything from the onset. So the present level is really where you document this. And so you might have a kid who's been in, special education for 7 years. You don't know what was used 4 years ago. So including some of that information about what type of methodology works for this kid. Maybe this kid responds better to peer-mediated instruction rather than adult, right? Or perhaps they need to be taught using more computer-assisted instruction rather than groups of kids, right? Because of the way the student learns or maybe some sensory needs they might have. So documenting not everything, but sufficient information in the PLAF can help the IEP team come to consensus about whether a particular methodology is necessary. Now, I did a paper on Orton-Gillingham, for example, about 15 years ago, and there's a lot. It's like the most litigated methodology, aside from ABA, in the special education law. And a lot of it came down to what is the data that indicates the kid needs Orton-Gillingham. And in most cases, the school district did win because the data just didn't exist to support that. Now, what happens is we need to do our due diligence, though, to determine what is the appropriate methodology for that student and be able to document it in our PLAF. And think about this methodology. There are different methodologies for teaching academics, and I'll share some of those. We know that explicit instruction has known effects across all academic areas. There are others that you'll see, like constant time delay or things like repeated readings that are unique to certain areas of academics. And so we think about, why is the student failing? Well, it's because the teacher is really doing good instruction in Tier 1, but that methodology that the Tier 1 teacher is using does not work for this kid. And so if we determine it's a methodology issue, the content's fine, but a methodology issue, then we would look at what is a more appropriate methodology adaptation. So what we're thinking about in this meeting is, first, we talked about last time, is what is the content that the student needs to be taught in order to benefit and access Tier 1. Now we're looking at, is there a specific approach to instruction that this student needs? Yes, we have to have something documented in the IEP. If right now we're like, it doesn't seem like it, then our IEP might not have a methodology adaptation. There are also, and you'll see, we'll look at some illustrations, but you'll also see it in the handout, that there are some methodology that we use specifically for certain functional areas. Toileting, for example, things like prompting strategies, task analytic teaching strategies are more appropriate from toileting than explicit instruction, right? Because you're not going to model for the student what that might look like. Even using video-based instruction might be an appropriate way depending on the student needs. So it's not a one-to-one to the disability category or to the content that the student needs to be taught, but there are some close relationships between, teaching social skills. We have some pretty good knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. Teaching executive functioning skills, explicit instruction is your go-to methodology. But kids might benefit from others. So we need to know, does the kid need it? So the last one I put on there is evidence of the evidence of the student's response to you using different methodology. So your initial IEP, you might not know, right? Because unless you tried that methodology in Tier 3 or prior to the student's eligibility determination, you may not really have data that confirms that the student needs this methodology. However, in your first year, as you're implementing that content adaptation and maybe your delivery adaptations, you need to collect data that looks at what are the types of methodology adaptations the student might need. And so that's where our progress monitoring comes into play, whether it's a functional behavior or an academic behavior. We start with something, let's say we were just teaching the kid with explicit instruction and he's not making that much progress. So you see that dotted line, I say, all right, I'm going to try something new. That's the cool thing about special education, right? Is we can use our data to make a decision to say, we need to do something different to help this student progress. So you could do that phase line, and then you could say, you know what, we're going to try Orton Gillingham, and we're going to see how the student responds to that. And if you see, for example, the student's progress was here on one methodology and here on another methodology, then that's where we start to have data or evidence that says this student has positively responded to this type of methodology. So our data indicates that's what the student needs. So you can see the same thing with academics, right? In Tier 3, like a database individualization is the way we can do this from an academic standpoint, right? So we put in our initial SDI from our IEP. We see how the student responds. You can see the first methodology content, it didn't really work. So then we make an adaptation. And remember, we're not going to make a ton. So we could make a content adaptation, methodology, or delivery. And so if you make a methodology adaptation, you can evaluate and say, well, that first adaptation, it did have a good effect, but it wasn't sufficient enough to get the student to their goal. So they made another adaptation. And once the data confirms that the student needs that adaptation, like in the third adaptation, that's where we start to talk about, do we need to amend the IEP? While we're trying to figure it out, those are things that are deference to the LEA, that we use our progress monitoring data and our knowledge of the evidence base to make decisions about what we do. Now, what I want to show, and I see there's questions in there, but Dina, I assume you're answering all of them. And if there's something that I need to answer or need to correct, that you'll just pop on and tell me. But I wanted to share some examples. I did write little blurbs of some of the most commonly known from a meta-analysis for supporting students with disabilities. And then you'll see some hyperlinks within that document. And there are some important points that I want to just share before I go through some of these things. There is no one methodology that works for students within or across a disability category. I think we often think about explicit instruction, for example, as being universally effective, kind of like medication. When you buy it, it doesn't work for everybody, but it tends to work for most people. And that's when we get to that terminology, universally effective. So you have to use that progress monitoring data to confirm whether the methodology that you're using works for this student. We use our knowledge to start off on the right foot, but our progress monitoring data determines if we stay on that path. I'll also say that a student's methodology needs or adaptations might change over time. You'll look at some of them and they'll say they're highly effective for kids in preschool and elementary, but they're just not effective at the secondary level. So we need to understand what are the limitations of that methodology overall, as well as for the student. And then as you'll also look through these, you'll see that the methodologies vary depending on the target skill or the age of the student or maybe the impact of the disability. So you might have 10 kids who have a diagnosis or an eligibility determination as a student with autism, but it doesn't mean the same methodology is going to work. Some kids might hate social stories, and other kids might, really prefer interacting with peers, right? So we have to use our knowledge of the student and our ongoing iterative changes to the instruction to find the right match. And I mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again. We only document methodology adaptations if the student's data indicate that that's what the student needs. There are two ways of thinking of, well, there's not two ways. The IEP, its purpose is to outline the services and aids that you have identified as what the student needs. When you get that IEP, there is deference to you in how you implement it, right? So I have a student who comes to me, they have a content adaptation that requires, oral reading fluency. That's the content. The delivery, which we'll talk about, they've determined, it's going to be 30 minutes of practice, but they don't list a methodology. That then is on me as the teacher to design and deliver that particular instruction. And so if there's nothing that says the kid needs it, then I can actually use different types of stuff. And we see that in the Orton-Gillingham case law where a parent really wanted something, but the data didn't indicate it was the needed thing. And the school district was doing something different, and it was still effective, but it wasn't that particular methodology because the data didn't support it. And I want to also be clear, because I think this Orton-Gillingham, interestingly, I was talking to someone and they had said, oh, well, that's a program. And I want to be clear that methodology is not the same as like your intervention program, like Read 180 or Read Naturally or whatever program you ended up purchasing or designing. The methodology is sort of intervention agnostic. It's your approach to delivering it. And Orton and Gillingham is a good example. And I'll show a video. Won't have audio, but I'll do the voiceover. Is that there are Orton Gillingham based programs, Wilson, Linda Mood Bell. Oh my heck, I can't even think of some of them. But there are a lot of purchase programs that use the Orton-Gillingham methodology. And so we're not identifying the program, we're only identifying the methodology that the student might need. All right, so I want to just share just some illustrations of what some of these methodologies might look like. I will say systematic explicit instruction is the most researched and most supported methodology for students. So if there is no methodology identified in the SDI of the IEP, then you probably were going to default to just systematic explicit instruction. And I'm going to talk about what it is and what it looks like. And then what I'd like to do is engage you all in a conversation about when would you use this? Like which type of learner or which learner needs do you think this most addresses, right? So explicit instruction, there have been numerous centers, the Cedar Center, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, have done a lot of work around explicit instruction. And I included those links in your handout. But it's a way of teaching in which the teacher is identifying the outcome of interest or the learning objectives, and then engages in a I do, we do, you do type model, right? And the intent is that I'm providing the student a sufficient number of practice opportunities with explicit feedback, right, or ongoing feedback. So it's not really a program, but if you look at a lot of the interventions that exist right now, explicit instruction is the methodology that is embedded within the design of the program. So it tries to take out any sort of error, right? We already have a student with a disability who's like a year or 2 years behind. So we want to use a methodology that's preventing the student from engaging in sort of this flailing, trying to figure it out. And instead, I just give it to you, right? I just tell you, I show you, we practice it until you get it to mastery. So this is what an illustration of it looks like. And there's a lot of evidence. So I talked about like the research base for it. So if somebody's like, well, what are you going to use? And you say explicit instruction, you've got a pretty good, research base that's going to support that. But your progress monitoring data, remember, will confirm it. So in that modeling is where we're asking the student, or we're showing the student what we're asking them to do, whether it's reading, writing, saying a word, or picking up something, or teaching a strategy. And then the biggest part of this is the practice piece. And we know from the research that kids with disabilities need about 10 to 30 more practice opportunities than a typically developing student. So when we think about explicit instruction, the core of it is the increased opportunities for practice with feedback, right? That go from, the teacher being there right beside me at the beginning to them eventually fading off, and the student becomes more independent in that practice. And you'll see down here at the bottom, there are supporting things that go along with it. These are not the things, right, we would include within an IEP, but they're known instructional practices that all teachers do to deliver good instruction. So I had mentioned about that guided practice and independent practice, and this is what makes this more generalizable to different disability categories and needs, because the model or the structure or methodology, let me use the right terminology, the methodology is consistent. I model, I provide guided practice, I provide independent practice. But what you'll see here is that some kids need a lot more modeling than others, right? And if you look at the bottom, you may need to break it into small pieces. And a kid with that modeling, guided practice, and independent practice, they get the skill quickly, but it needs to be broken into small parts. So it allows for that flexibility across different disability categories and different needs that students might have. So I think that's my last one. So this is my video, which you can't hear it, but the cool thing about it is accessible, and it does have the closed captioning at the bottom. But I'm going to show you a reading example, and I'll just keep it very short. But the neat thing about this is it's not rocket science, and I think part of that is us as special ed teachers. This is our go-to methodology that we would end up using for students. So let me reshare because I have to share a different screen. I'm sorry. So ignore all my stuff that's here, but oh my heck. All right, so maybe I didn't have it. All right. We're just like I'm a hot mess today, and I apologize for that. So I just got to click the link on it. Hold on. And the video that I am going to show you here
Did you know that Amazon has a
the cool thing about it is these are all free on the IES website. All right, so let me share this with you. I have to redo it, so be patient. It's almost like I need SDI right now. All right. So I'm going to, I don't think you can hear it, so I'm going to just turn it down so I can talk with you through here. And if you can hear it, if you will let me know, because that would be a miracle. Okay. So what you'll see here is that she is explicitly modeling what she's supposed to do, right? So you're going to move the letters, you're going to count with your fingers. And at the beginning of each explicit lesson, it's very clear what the student is supposed to do so that we can then come back and then provide those practice opportunities and feedback.
Hey, Tessie.
Yeah.
Gilbert had said that they could hear it through your speakers, so I'm not sure.
Oh, miracle. And let me turn it up a little bit. Hold on.
I'll touch the letters as I make the sound.
So she's modeling still.
I read the whole word, I'll do my finger under it. Doug. You can still just watch. Now I'm gonna change one letter to change Doug to dig. So look at my letters here. Raise your hand if you can tell me what letter do you think I should change to make Doug turn into dig?
So these are the supporting practices. She's pausing.
So I'm going to take the U away, put the I in the middle. So let's all say dig. Dig. That sounded.
That's our guided practice.
So now we're going to start with the new word.
So I'll stop right there. But what you'll see is it's just pretty concrete. If I want the student to do something, I show them how to do it. I model it, and then I walk them through a practice opportunity with me. And then I let them do it on their own. And then I provide feedback for that. So when you think about like the delivery of your SDI, we often think about the program we selected for that. But in reality, if you have the methodology of explicit instruction within your IEP, you can honestly pick any purchase program as long as it has that methodology built within it, and it has the content adaptations or the delivery adaptations that were also part of that programming. Sorry, let me get back here. Usually I'm much cooler and I can keep this going. So, oh my heck. Well, I'll just go to this next one, and you can actually look within your handout. There is time delay, and I'm not sure to what extent you all use time delay, but it is considered a highly effective. It's got 30 plus years of research. But if you also look at the description, you'll find that it really meets the needs of a narrow group of students. So I generally wouldn't use something like time delay for, I don't know, teaching kids reading, maybe for sight words or math facts, but it's often for students with intellectual disabilities or students with autism. So I am going to show a video of what it looks like. I'll cross my fingers that it does work. And then I'm going to pause on this one. The explicit instruction, I think we know how to use that, but think about a student need that you've seen in which constant time delay might be appropriate. And because of the way I shared, I can't flip over to the, so I apologize for that, but I can't flip over to the video. So this doesn't have a student in it, which is probably good. So it's just a teacher modeling. And as I mentioned, it's most effective for students who have more significant disabilities, maybe severe autism or cognitive delays. And so you'll see that there is a delay. That's the main piece of it. But this is called a progressive delay, meaning it starts with 0, errorless learning, and then it moves on to a delay in which I'm giving the student a chance to be able to respond. But the intent of something like this is to prevent error, right? So I'm not going to let the student fail. I'm going to try to jump in on it right from the onset. And we won't watch the whole 6 minutes of it, but I just wanted you to see what it looks like.
Show me cow. Good job. That's a cow.
So 0 delay.
Show me eggs. Amazing. That's right. Those are eggs. Show me fork. Fork.
So very direct.
Show me lamb. Amazing. That's a lamb. Show me hot dog. This is a hot dog. Show me toothbrush. Great job. That's a toothbrush. Show me cupcake. Amazing. That's a cupcake. Show me elephant. Elephant. Show me hamburger. Perfect. That's a hamburger. Show me hairbrush.
So the first part started out with a 0 second, and you'll notice that there was full prompting that was, we're trying to prevent any sort of error. And even though the student is getting error within this, it's almost justifying that this type of progressive time delay or even a time delay strategy would be effective for the student, because we don't have time to wait for the student to figure it out. They're just not responding. So we'll watch it just one more time and you'll see it's just a very slight delay on how the teacher is waiting. Generally, we try to get to a 5-second delay. For those of you who work with kids with more significant behavior problems, you want them to respond to a request within 3 seconds. This is an example of this, right? But having a student respond and her providing immediate feedback is a little bit different, right? Because even though she provided immediate feedback, the student still didn't do anything.
Show me a horse. Awesome job. That's a horse. Show me fork. Way to go. That's a fork.
So if you look at what actually delayed, it was her prompting strategy of her finger. So in the initial one, she said fork, she was touching fork, 0 delay. Here she said touch fork, waited 1 second, and then she ended up pointing to it. So that was the prompt for the 1 second delay. So I'm curious if anyone is using any sort of time delay strategies. We see this with teaching colors, discriminating from tasks, cognitive tasks for students. So if you can just share in the chat box, you know, if you've seen this or something you think this might be useful for one of your students. I see some hands raised. I don't think we can unmute
No,
folks.
and
Yeah,
no,
okay.
and they'll have to put it in the Q&A instead of the chat.
Okay.
The chat,
Okay.
I will be able to share, but they won't be able to share. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So if you raised your hand, just use the Q&A and you can put in some of it and then I'll read it out. And while we're waiting, I'm going to respond to Brady. And Brady asked, so who's responsible for implementing and finding the training? And I think this is a fascinating question. So that program modifications and supports for school personnel, those are services for the adults responsible for delivering. As a result, it's usually the administration of that school. Some districts, it might be your special ed director, but if that service goes in there, it's really the LEA's responsibility to ensure that those services are provided. So hopefully that helps. So yeah, we have a student so trying time delay with for autism having significant behaviors. Yes, and we have an example of vowel and digraph blends and parts of speech, right? So if you could think about, you've got a kid who's 4 years behind, we don't have time, right? We've got to give them, we've got to get to that errorless learning. I know for my student, I have a kid that we're working on math facts. I need him to know his math facts pretty efficiently because he has a recall challenge. So we're trying to get that so that it doesn't take as long to be able to respond. Abby talked about letters, teaching numbers, sight words. Yeah, any sort of discrete content is a great strategy for. I'll say with this particular strategy, if you identify it as the methodology adaptation, you should be able to design the program, the SDI that you're doing for that student starting day one. Because in using something like constant time delay, you'll see that she had a very clear routine. She has a very clear scope and sequence of 0, 1, 2 with the delays. And she has a very consistent feedback strategy. So it's a great strategy to methodology to teach paraeducators so that you're getting this repetition. It can be a little boring for adults, but it's a way to get that information there. So I have just a question. So when I have a group of 3 and a student likes to answer questions or prompts, even though he's incorrect, I do a count to 3 strategy. That is great. So you're almost doing the reverse, right? Is that you're trying to delay his response. Where on the other ones, they're trying to get a response. So yeah, and I think that's a way to think about it. And so we have just not a question, but a response. So using the time delay approach when offering choices, exactly. So more of the for behavior, so more with challenging learners, like with A and B. Yeah. And I think it's a little tricky with like choice making because I don't know what's the internal decision making that I'm trying to get the student to do, but the time delay is this is what you have to do. So I need you to respond, and I'm showing the response I need to see within that 1 second. Yeah, we see it with verbalizing responses to math facts. Exactly. Great number ID. Excellent. Yeah, lots of great uses. And I'm curious if any of you document that in your IEP, or is it more of a methodology that you use to implement the IEP? I'm going to move us back because I'm going to share another one. And similar, I think the time delay is used quite a bit. And I think a lot of us are familiar with discrete trial teaching. It is a ABA approach, and you'll see it the pivotal response training that's also in your app handout are just different ways that are kind of like these adaptations of the time delay, but have a very clear evidence base for what it looks like in practice. So, oh shoot, my screen sharing stopped, but that's okay. So I'm going to just share this one as well. And then the last one I want to share is actually an Orton-Gillingham approach, but this is a discrete trial teaching. So it's not a very long video. It's only 50 seconds. So think about like, where have you seen this? Do you have this documented as a methodology in your IEP? Or who might this be good for?
Again, fishy. Fishy. Okay, let's work for the fish.
So that's the desired outcome.
Yay, you got the cup. Yes. That's the cup. You got it. You get fishy.
So you'll see some elements, right, of the time delay that's embedded within there. I'm going to do this one next, but I'm just curious, you know, are you all using this type of approach, or have you evaluated whether it works for your student? Do you have some students who maybe have DTT documented as a methodology, or maybe ABA? And I would say that some people often want to put ABA, but generally we would say the methodology would be the DTT, and then the ABA is part of the therapy as well that goes along with it. It's much bigger for students. I don't see any other examples. I see lots of folks still using the time delay. And we did have a question, is like, I think for either of these, the question is relevant, is how do you assess the understanding of the concept? So that's like you just saw with the cup, or, you know, with the fork. That's where we get into what are the stimuli that we use. So in this example, they used an actual cup. So that's where you might say you need physical objects, where in the other one, they're using images. So those are like the adaptations that we get to really understand what does this student need when I deliver the instruction. Great. All right, so the last one I just want to share is around the Orton-Gillingham method. And I would say that we often don't use the terminology Orton-Gillingham as a methodology within an IEP. And you'll see on the handout, we talk more about multisensory methodology. There is a lot of research, particularly there's like the Lawrence School, that are designed for students specifically with learning disabilities that have very significant outcomes, positive outcomes for students with severe learning disabilities. I think from an implementation in a school, it becomes a little more challenging, because in order for this type of methodology to really be effective, the same methodology should be used within the tier 1. And then what's happening in your SDI is intensifying for the student. But when it's used, like you're using a multisensory approach in special ed classroom, and then in the tier 1, they're using something different, they almost counteract each other. So you have to be very careful about, you know, working with your gen ed teacher for these types of methodologies. All right, so this is the last one.
Methodology we use, or the IMSC approach we've used, is just that it's more of a methodology. It's less of a curriculum. There is some scripted information, but it's just basically walking the teachers through teaching a specific scope and sequence.
So the scope and sequence is determined from the onset. It's not like on the fly.
IMSC really instructs us to integrate movement and sensory input multiple times a day, whether it's writing our red words into the carpet or writing our sounds into sand. What we're doing with a kinetic approach is getting more sensory input that helps the learning stick and kind of works with those neurons and pathways in our brain to really solidify and consolidate that understanding and learning.
The biggest part of that approach is that students are learning foundational skills, phonics, reading, decoding, encoding through a very specific scope. So in kindergarten, they're getting these things. By first grade, they're getting these things. By second grade, they're getting these things. And it's building on itself.
Is green if it's a compound word. That second part is.
So you'll see she's using physical, visual.
Today we saw segmenting and finger tapping. So segmenting, identifying the specific sounds within a word and writing them one at a time as we say it. We're tapping, we're pounding syllables. We're also putting our hand under our chin as we segmented the syllables in apostrophe. And then we also, with the sand, we were writing the multiple spellings of different sounds. So for example, the k sound, we know 3 ways to spell that sound, and we wrote C says k, K says k, CK says k.
So I'll share these examples with you, but I think this idea that some students will likely need a multisensory approach. And that's why it often ends up in the case law, because trying to do a multisensory approach just within the context of SDI is very challenging. So understanding whether a student needs a particular methodology is really critical in being able to communicate with families and other educators within that educational context. I'm just going to close up. Not sure why my stuff always, but I just want to share, real quick too, is one more approach, which is the task analytic instruction. And as you see in the handout, we see this commonly with students with more significant disabilities, but for kids who have metacognitive and cognitive challenges, this type of task analysis is exactly what we might do within trying to solve a problem, trying to analyze a written passage, complete a multi-step mathematic, calculation. So while it's mostly researched in terms of students with very significant disabilities, its application is, I think, everywhere. I'm sure you've been to a McDonald's in which they have it, outlined in photos in the back of the building. But there is some information there's like a how-to, particularly for kids with autism, in that handout that's there. I know Alana mentioned that, there's the brain spring phonics first uses a multisensory approach. And I think that's a good example of how we might identify a methodology that's required for the SDI, and then we look for, let's say, an intervention or program that exists that has those elements already in it. And that allows us to use a purchase program, right? Because it's meeting those adaptations. Oops. So just in summary, as we close up, as we think about this methodology, content, as I mentioned last time, the most important part, because if you look through how a student has been identified, they do have some knowledge skill area in which they need SDI. The question then becomes, do they also need a particular methodology to be able to progress, right? So we really need to understand the impact of the disability. In our next session, we'll really dive into the delivery adaptations. It's probably where we have the most challenges, right? Like, what does it look like? Did we pull the kid out? How do we know it's 30 minutes versus 40 minutes? Is it okay to have, 6 kids in a group, or, does it have to be delivered by the special ed teacher, or what happens if a pair is there? So those are the things we'll talk about. There are 2 questions I want to get to before we hop off. And in April had mentioned, should evaluation reports give recommendations? I think, yes, they can give recommendations, but really what we're looking for is the evaluation report identifies the nature of the need, right? It should document this kid needs this. Now, your evaluation report might say something like, as a school's like, I recommend Orton Gillingham. That's a little bit different than if I said, this student needs Orton Gillingham to be able to progress. And I think there was a question related to the constant time delay. Is like, would something like that work for a 2nd grade student who doesn't know the alphabet? I think that's a perfect example. Same with sight words, where you're teaching something that's like, what word? This word is blue. And so it's an appropriate strategy for a student with that type of significant need. Well, I don't see any other questions, but I just want to say thank you for joining today. We will have the audio set up next time, and I'll share the links to those videos. You will have access to the PowerPoint, and you have your handout. So please give us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And then just remember, there's still that question place where you can just just download. You can submit them anonymously, so that we can really dive into the nuances, right? We don't know everything about what works for kids with disabilities. That's why, we engage in these conversations and, evaluating how kids are doing. So thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day. If you have any other questions, just put them in the chat box and I'll stay on for a little bit. Oh shoot. Can you share the link in the to the evaluation in the chat box?
Yes, and I'm also
Okay.
putting in the chat the certificate of attendance if they need that
Great.
here. There is
Yep.
a question though while
Yeah,
you're doing
and
that.
that is a great question. And the question says, do you think the focus on methodology gets lost as students get older? I will just answer the first question. I think the focus on SDI overall gets lost. And we tend to focus more on accommodating students within the general curriculum. And we often struggle to provide the SDI that they need. That includes SDI that requires a different methodology or delivery. And I think part of that is just the structure of a secondary setting. So it's really important to engage principals in saying, this is what this student needs. How can we modify the schedule? That's part of your program modifications of your IEP to ensure that the student both gets access to the general curriculum and access to their STI afforded under the IEP. Yeah, and I think the other thing too is the content changes in the secondary, where we focus a lot more on strategy, metacognitive and cognitive strategies, rather than the SDI for academic content. And I think there's just some mixed thinking about that. I mean, you've been trying to teach the kid for 10 years and they're not getting it. It could be because we're focusing on the wrong thing, right? That's preventing the kid from being successful. Wes, I think Dina's putting the link in the chat box for that. Yeah, but there was working with a co-teacher who knows SDI very well, and the secondary is so helpful. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys. Yeah, keep your questions coming. Hopefully, Wes, you got that. I can't really see the chat very well. Oh,
Yes,
she's going to put the link in the follow-up email. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And you should have everything in the chat. There's the evaluation link. There's the certificate of attendance link. The handouts are there, as well as the book study registration.
Yep. So I have a question. I want to make sure I get to it. And this has to do, with the constant time delay example, Sophia, that you're talking about. There are actually recording sheets that you can use. And I don't know if you noticed on the discrete trial teaching and then on constant time delay, we do the same thing. You actually take data on every trial. So you may have an IEP goal that says, the student will be able to identify 20 commonly known vocabulary, whereas I'm just making something up, within 3 seconds. And it could be the 3 seconds is the long goal. And right now I'm going to provide in my progress report that this student is at 0 delay with 80% accuracy. So you saw that student missing some of them. And the goal is we want, it's probably 80 to 100% accuracy on 0 before we move to a 1 second delay. So it's like different stages of progress towards that ultimate goal that's been set. The IRIS Center, IRIS, has a lot of those sample recording sheets for data collection and data summary. Okay, great. Can you add the question in? Maybe I don't have it. The one from the last session. Oh, yeah. So no, they're two different things. The needs and impact is part of the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statement. So the IEP has 7 required components. The first one is really what are the needs? What's the impact of the disability? What is the parent input? All of that stuff that's there. The SDI is part of your statement of services and aids, which includes your supplementary aids and services, related services, SDI, and that program modifications or supports for school personnel. So hopefully that helps. And I can get the tip sheets. I don't know if you're still on, but yeah, I have a tip sheet that would be probably the most relevant for you that outlines all of them. So give me like 1 second. The other thing I would recommend is checking out the WDE's online modules, because there are a ton of them that can help sort of dive into those specific pieces of that. So I think I can put this in the chat box. I don't know if I have chat box skills. Oh yeah, I do. So here are the
If not,
tip sheets.
Tessie,
Yeah.
oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, there we go. If not, if
We'll
you'll,
include them in the follow-up
I'll
email.
include it in the follow-up.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, y'all.
Well, thank you. And Tessie, thank you so much. This has,
Yeah.
you have fed us very well tonight.
Now I can
This
go
has been
home, sleep on the
amazing.
couch, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you. I know it's been a long day for you teaching in your classrooms and all of the other many things that you have to attend to throughout the day, and then joining us in the afternoon. So I really appreciate your time. Again, these recordings and the materials will be sent in a follow-up email. I do hear back that some of you are not getting some of these links, attachments, and I'm not sure if it's the firewall or what, but if you will just re-email me, and it could be when I'm sending it in a larger email that might be preventing you from receiving those. So if you don't get it, resend me an email and I will send it to you just, by yourself, solo, so that hopefully you'll get it. But again, thank you so much and have a wonderful night.